Welcome to the Future of Infrastructure and Wildlife Protection session at the Animal Legal Defense Fund's Virtual Animal Law Symposium. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Kathleen Schatzmann, and I'm the Strategic Legislative Affairs Manager at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Renee Callahan is the Executive Director of Animal Road Crossing Solutions, where she leads an interdisciplinary, not-for-profit partnership of transportation and wildlife agencies, universities, non-governmental and charitable organizations working to ensure wildlife crossing structures are built wherever they are needed. Alicia Prygoski is a Senior Legislative Affairs Manager at the Animal Legal Defense Fund, where she works to develop and advance the Animal Legal Defense Fund's legislative campaigns at the local, state, and federal levels. Thank you all for joining us today. We will begin with a presentation from Alicia.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Kathleen. It is so great to be speaking today about the future of wildlife protection with a particular focus on wildlife habitat connectivity and safe passage for wild animal species. Today, I'll be covering the different kinds of wildlife crossings and discussing legislation designed to protect wildlife and prevent habitat fragmentation. So first, let's take a look at the different kinds of wildlife crossings. When we hear the words wildlife crossing, many of us think about this kind of yellow sign that we often see by the side of the road, letting us know to be on the lookout for deer, bears, other species of wildlife who might frequent an area. We see these very often, especially in forested areas. This actually is not the kind of wildlife crossing we're talking about today, though. We're talking about wild places designed to improve and restore habitat connectivity and prevent wildlife death from vehicle collisions. So here we have two pictures. We have wildlife corridors and what I'll be referring to as wildlife crossings. Now, these are both excellent mechanisms for protecting habitat connectivity, but they function a little bit differently, and obviously they are made a little differently. So a wildlife corridor, as you can see, is an uninterrupted strip of natural land that has been left intact so that wildlife can safely cross from one area to another. These are typically areas where animals are known to travel, and they could be migration routes, seasonal migration routes often, or routes that animals might use on a daily basis to seek out food and seek out water and then return back home to their shelter or to their den. Then there are the wildlife crossings, which is the other picture. Obviously a human-made structure that is built over or under a road. And so that's usually a bridge or a tunnel. And these are built to help facilitate movement of wildlife safely across roads. So they're typically built very strategically in areas where wildlife are known to cross roads or in areas where we've seen a high rate of wildlife mortality from those vehicle collisions. And these crossings can be built inside natural wildlife corridors, actually, to help reconnect the areas that have been split up by roads. So there are a lot of factors that go into determining where wildlife corridors are and then how to properly restore them. But it's interesting because including these crossings within the natural corridors, it's one way to help facilitate movement. Crossings don't always have to be within natural corridors, but they often can be. It's just a question of what is going to most effectively help wildlife get across the road safely and help reduce that fragmentation that we see for so many wild habitats. All right, so now let's take a look at why we need corridors and crossings, why we need to protect wildlife from this kind of risk. So I've broken it down into two main reasons. And one is to prevent wildlife vehicle collisions. The other is to prevent habitat fragmentation. So wildlife collisions with vehicles, it's a serious problem on US roadways. It's estimated that between 1 and 2 million wildlife vehicle collisions occur in the United States every single year. That's a lot. It is a rough estimate because a lot of them actually are not even reported. And then others, it's tough to tell sometimes whether a car has hit an animal, especially if that animal is able to leave the scene of the accident. So that's a rough estimate, but that's a significant number. So these collisions, unfortunately, they also kill thousands of humans every year. And a study was done. So annually, they cost more than $8.3 billion in insurance and damages annually. The vast majority of the collisions, the animal dies immediately or shortly after the accident due to serious injuries incurred from hitting the car. And then in some areas, the animal mortality from wildlife vehicle collisions can also be a threat to endangered species populations. Not only the individual animals who are so unfortunately hit by the cars, but the overall population as well. So if a population is made up of already endangered species, and then there might be compounding factors such as habitat loss from development, these deaths of these individual animals from the wildlife vehicle collisions, it really does add up, and it takes a toll on these animal populations in certain areas. That's definitely something that we've seen because, unfortunately, wildlife vehicle collisions do also involve endangered species sometimes. And then there's the issue of habitat fragmentation. This network of roads across the country has split up natural territories and habitats for millions of wild animals, which makes it all that more difficult for them to seek out food and water and shelter and to follow those seasonal migration patterns that they have for years without having to cross roads and highways. They are now more at risk than they were prior to the roads and highways being in place. So preserving and restoring wilderness, especially the areas that are already known as wildlife corridors, it can help connect wildlife habitats and allow wild populations to flourish when they would have just otherwise struggled and been hit by cars and had those vehicle animal collisions. So just one of many examples of how effective prioritizing wildlife corridors and crossings can be. Montana is a really good example. So in Montana, there are 122 wildlife crossings. And so 81 of those crossings are located on one particular highway. One study of the crossings showed that 24 different species of animals used them, which is hugely significant. You can see just by the varied number of animals using them that these are effective. But then another study actually looked at the reduction in wildlife vehicle collisions and found that the most effective and the most strategically placed crossings reduced wildlife vehicle collisions by nearly 100%. So that wasn't the case with all of them. But even the crossings that were the least effective, maybe not placed in as strategic of an area, as highly trafficked of an area, even those crossings still reduced collisions by around 50%. So it's just hugely significant considering the extensive number of collisions that we see every year. So now I want to dive into some of the legislative efforts to protect natural corridors and to fund corridor restoration and building crossings. We've seen this kind of legislation introduced at all levels of government, and it's absolutely critical for continued protection of these pathways for wildlife species. All right, so now we have a couple of individual federal bills to discuss, the first being the Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act. This act was introduced by U.S. Senator Ben Ray Lujan from New Mexico and Representative Ruben Gallego from Arizona. This bill was introduced with the specific purpose of funding wildlife migration corridors and providing tribal nations with resources to preserve existing corridors and also to develop new ones. It does this by authorizing a set amount of funding every year for what the bill establishes as the Tribal Corridors Grant Program. So it sets up a grant program specifically for this purpose. And then in addition to setting that up, and in addition to the funding, the bill also works to increase coordination so that tribal governments and federal agencies and state agencies and private landowners, they're all better equipped to work together to identify and maintain wildlife corridors. And that is really important because animals don't recognize jurisdictional boundaries. They just don't. They're going to travel from tribal lands onto federal lands, onto private lands, and so on. And so any kind of legislation like this that increases coordination and increases the ability of these different agencies and jurisdictions to work together is going to have a really positive effect on the overall outcome. So then there is the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. This is another federal bill. This was introduced by former Senator Tom Udall from New Mexico and Representative Don Beyer from Virginia. The legislation allows federal agencies to designate national wildlife corridors on federal lands and to help preserve natural pathways for wildlife. It also establishes a wildlife movement grant program. So again, you're seeing additional funding, which is really important. And that program would fund projects to facilitate the uninterrupted movement of wildlife through federal lands, and then also tribal lands and privately owned. So we're seeing a lot of the same themes here, but this is really good. Collaboration and ensuring that animals are able to move across jurisdictions appropriately. So this bill also establishes a committee designed to coordinate efforts to improve connectivity. And then it establishes a database to help gather information on corridors to better inform future decisions, because that's something that we're always looking at too, is that information gathering piece of this so that we can have that information readily accessible. How many collisions there are, how is this affecting wildlife, how is it affecting habitat fragmentation, and what are the appropriate next steps to restore that. So this bill was included as part of a larger piece of legislation, the Invest in America Act. And we see that typically with a lot of bills in Congress where, we can try to get a piece of legislation that helps animals into a bigger bill that we know is going to pass. So it was included in the Invest Act, which is a 5-year surface transportation and infrastructure bill. Now the House passed a version that included the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. And that's huge. That signals the importance of preventing habitat fragmentation for wildlife. So the bill language in its entirety was actually not included in the final version of the Invest Act, but it did include significant funding for corridors and connectivity, which Renee is going to speak about more in depth in a few moments. So now we can move on to state and local legislation. It's also important to note that state and local legislation on corridors and crossing has played a really significant role in influencing federal policy. You see this often where legislation is passed at the local level and it gains momentum, and then it starts getting passed at the state level, and it makes it all that much easier to get it on the radar of the federal government and to eventually pass federal legislation too, and to change federal policy. So there have been dozens of efforts by state and local governments to prevent habitat fragmentation and reduce these wildlife vehicle collisions. I want to take a closer look at the legislative landscape for corridors and connectivity, specifically at the state level. So as you can see, several states have already enacted wildlife corridor laws. You can see that on the list on the slide on the left-hand side. And then others are actively working to pass corridor legislation. And there are some states as well that have taken regulatory action to improve corridors and crossings when they can. The state agencies have worked on this too. So this is really a topic that is on the radar of several state legislatures, especially with so many species becoming endangered, with the loss of biodiversity that we're experiencing. This is something that thankfully state legislatures are taking seriously. So one example of this, just last year, we supported legislation that passed in Florida called the Florida Wildlife Corridor Act. And legislation recognized the importance of wildlife corridors, and then it also allocated $400 million in funding to preserve the state's network of wildlife corridors. And that's critical for preserving some of Florida's most iconic species, like the Florida panther and the black bear. So Florida was also able to allocate additional funding to wildlife corridors throughout the state. This is something that the legislature has been considering for quite some time. It's something that advocates in Florida have done a really good job pushing forward. And we were really excited to see that because that'll help preserve the habitat of some of these important species in Florida. So then I just wanted to mention some other states, and this is by no means an extensive list. There are so many examples of this kind of legislation and funding. So we have Colorado. That was another state to recently pass legislation to preserve corridors and to plan for habitat connectivity. Oregon has passed legislation to develop a wildlife corridor action plan. That's something we've seen in several states. And the Oregon legislation also was focused on specifically reducing those wildlife vehicle collisions. New Mexico has done the same thing, creating a wildlife corridor action plan. And then Virginia recently passed two bills. One was to create that wildlife corridor action plan that we've seen. And the second was to direct state agencies to incorporate the recommendations of that plan into their own agendas and planning for roads and infrastructure. So not only getting those recommendations and getting that information out there, but facilitating and helping state agencies plan for it. Plan for including wildlife corridors into their own agendas, because state agencies can so often become siloed. So that was a really positive thing to see as well. Wyoming has established 3 corridors specific to mule deer migration across the state. And I thought this one was interesting because it shows that in some states, these seasonal migrations are so vast and involve so many animals that there are corridors being established specifically for certain species. Now, those corridors are going to benefit a whole host of other species as well, but it's great to see corridors that are going to address specific migrations of species across states. California recently passed legislation to incentivize the creation of wildlife crossings, and then several states have done something similar to Florida, allocating significant state funding to creating and preserving corridors and crossings. So that's just a small sample of the state and local legislation that's been passed across the country to protect, preserve, restore wildlife corridors, and to create safe passage for animals across roads. I encourage everybody to explore what's going on in your own state, explore what's been done, what legislation might be pending, and if there are any current legislative efforts that you could support to further progress for corridors, that would be fantastic. So really, to conclude, with approximately 1 million plant and animal species currently facing extinction, and with habitat loss and fragmentation being a major driver of that, preserving corridors and migration routes and reducing wildlife vehicle collisions, it's absolutely essential in preventing further loss of biodiversity. This is something that we absolutely need to stop the loss of biodiversity and to reverse that. So that concludes my presentation for today. Thank you so much for listening and for tuning in to learn more about such a critical topic. If you do have questions about any of the legislation or laws that I mentioned, or about wildlife corridors in general, here's my email. Please get in touch. Thank you.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I'd like to thank you all for joining today's session. I'd also like to thank the Symposium organizers for inviting me to present today. My name is Renee Callahan. I'm the director of Ark Solutions, and I'm joining you today from Bozeman, Montana. For those of you who are not familiar with Ark, we are a not-for-profit network. We work on raising awareness about the proven success of wildlife crossings and reducing wildlife vehicle collisions, and on fostering innovation in the placement, construction, and design of wildlife crossing structures. I would encourage you all to check us out online at ark-solutions.org, or to reach out to me directly after today's talk if you'd like to learn more. I'm going to start today's session with a roadmap of where we're headed. First, I'm going to lead off with a quick overview of some of the effects of roads on wildlife. Then I'll provide a high-level summary of some of the wildlife crossing funding and policy opportunities in the new infrastructure law passed last November. And then finally, I'm going to take a few minutes at the very end to share some on-the-ground crossing stories in hopes of inspiring folks to consider engaging on this issue in your own communities. So let's take a look at the issue of roads. Despite being an incredible asset to the public, roads are one of the most disruptive human-made forces on the planet today. In the US alone, there are over 250 million cars and more than 4 million miles of roadways. As a nation, we travel over 8 billion miles in our cars every day. And just to give you some context for what that number looks like, it's roughly the distance from the sun to Pluto. Annually, that is over 3 trillion miles. And again, that's in the US alone and in a single year. Motorist crashes with wildlife result in about 200 human deaths and close to 30,000 injuries each year, in addition to the loss of an estimated 1 to 2 million large animals that are killed in these crashes. So basically about 1 every 26 seconds. In 2007, these crashes cost Americans more than $8 billion annually. And when you convert that number to 2002 dollars, it's over 11 billion. Again, that's an annual figure. In addition to direct wildlife mortality, roads also have other harmful effects, including loss of habitat and the potential to act as barriers to wildlife movement, wildlife migration, and also gene flow. Yet, unlike so many issues we face today, we actually know that there are proven solutions to this problem. Properly sited wildlife crossings with fencing have been shown to effectively reduce wildlife vehicle collisions by up to 97%. So a road that saw 100 crashes last year could see as few as 3 this year after mitigation. And that's basically off the charts in terms of effectiveness and return on investment in transportation infrastructure. Moreover, on roads with high crash rates, roughly 5 or more deer vehicle collisions per mile per year, we know that it actually costs society more to do nothing than it costs to install wildlife crossings and to solve this problem once and for all. So this really begs the question, why isn't more being done? Although the answer is complicated, we know that funding is a major obstacle. Based on a 2012 survey conducted by the Western Transportation Institute, one of Ark's partners, the overwhelming majority of US and state DOT agency representatives, 68% of them, identified funding as the #1 barrier to deploying crossing structures. The good news is that the new infrastructure law addresses this obstacle by providing new and expanded funding eligibilities for wildlife infrastructure. I'm going to walk through a number of programs that are covered in the new law. And the first program I want to highlight, which has been getting a lot of attention, I'm very excited to see, is the standalone wildlife crossing pilot. This program created for the first time ever a 5-year, $350 million competitive grant program for projects aimed at reducing wildlife vehicle collisions while improving habitat connectivity. Eligible applicants and additional selection criteria are shown here. And one of those secondary criteria that I'm especially excited about is the inclusion of innovative design elements. If I had to leave you with one takeaway about this program, it's the fact that the funding is dedicated. So unlike many of the other federal highway programs, crossings aren't competing with potholes or pavement for funding. In addition to the pilot, the new law also expands eligibilities under several other new and existing federal programs. The first of these is the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. This program has been expanded to include both construction of wildlife crossing structures, as well as projects and strategies aimed at reducing the number of wildlife vehicle collisions. The new law also expands the list of projects eligible under the Nationally Significant Freight and Highway Program, which is known as Infra for short. Wildlife crossing projects are newly eligible under this program. A notice of funding opportunity that included a common application was issued in March for this program. And what that means is that eligible entities can use the same application to apply for both this program and the next program that I'm going to highlight. Applications are due in May. This is the second program that is eligible under that same common application as the Infra program. And this is also another new national competitive grant program. It's called the Rural Surface Transportation Grant Program. It's $2 billion over 5 years. And the focus of this program is on projects that will improve the quality of life in rural communities. And as I mentioned, same common application as the Infra program. Applications are due in May. And I'll tell you at the very end of this talk how best to locate those applications online. The next program I want to highlight is actually an existing program. It's known as the Federal Lands Transportation Program. For those of you who are familiar with this program, you'll know that wildlife infrastructure is already eligible. What you may not know is that there used to be an annual $10 million cap on how much federal land managers could spend on mitigation measures aimed at reducing wildlife vehicle collisions. The new law doubled that annual cap to $20 million per year. The law also includes a new program to encourage investment in bridges. Although the focus is on repairing bridges in poor or nearly poor condition, up to 5% of the available funding may be used to replace or rehabilitate culverts to improve aquatic habitat connectivity and resiliency to funding. A notice of funding is expected for this program in May. I also want to touch on this new hybrid formula grant program known as the Protect program. And I want to be clear, wildlife crossing structures are not directly eligible for funding under this program, but it does provide funding for a new type of improvement known as protective features. These features, which include things like upsizing culverts, replacing culverts with bridges, raising or lengthening bridges, may offer the potential to improve habitat connectivity while also improving infrastructure resiliency. Another program I want to flag is the National Culvert Removal, Replacement, and Restoration Grant Program. This focuses on restoring safe passage for anadromous fish. It's a total of $1 billion in funding over 5 years, and a notice of funding is expected out later this summer for this program. The new law also included a new $10 million grant program to benefit pollinators. Unfortunately, this program was not funded for the current fiscal year, but I did want to flag it in hopes that it will be funded in the future. And then the last funding pot I want to highlight is for transportation alternatives. This is around $7 billion over the next 5 years. Eligible activities include environmental mitigation aimed at reducing wildlife vehicle collisions or maintaining terrestrial or aquatic connectivity. And the thing that is unique about this program is that it does employ a competitive grant program, but instead of being at the national level, it is at the state level. And the other thing that is unique about this program is that NGOs are eligible to apply directly for these funds. So I would encourage folks to check out the Federal Highway's new guidance on this program. If you search for Transportation Alternatives Program and Federal Highways or USDOT, it'll pull up information about this program. I also want to add that each state has a Transportation Alternatives Coordinator. And when you look at the Federal Highways website on the Transportation Alternatives Program, you will see on the left-hand side that there's a link for you to identify the TAP coordinator in your state. The Act also contains a number of policy-related elements. I've listed them here. I won't have time to cover them all, but I did want to call out a couple in particular. The first one I want to flag is this revision to the definition of construction. This statutory definition of this word has now been revised to expressly include improvements to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions. So if there was ever any doubt about wildlife mitigation being included in a highway construction project as an eligible expense, that doubt has now been removed. The other item I want to call to your attention is the U.S. Department of Transportation Secretary will be developing a standardized methodology for collecting and reporting spatially accurate wildlife collision and carcass data, and also a national template to encourage the voluntary implementation of that new standard. The last two things I want to flag relate to voluntary guidance. The first is voluntary guidance that will be forthcoming about when a highway should be evaluated for potential mitigation measures. And then the second is guidance on developing voluntary joint statewide transportation and wildlife action plans. And that guidance should be forthcoming in the next 2 years. So I just want to switch gears for a little bit at the end here and provide you with a few stories of other successful wildlife crossing projects. These stories are featured in Ark's wonderful world of wildlife crossings. This is an interactive map. It features over 40 stories from 25 states. And if you look on our homepage, there's a rotating carousel at the top. And if you click over to the third image on that carousel, you will see this map. So the first story I want to highlight is this wonderful story that has a lot of unsung heroes. And I do want to just tie it back to our discussion of the Transportation Alternatives Grant Program that I mentioned a few slides ago. This local group in Moncton, Vermont, secured not just one, but 2 transportation alternatives grants. The first was to conduct a feasibility study, and the second was to construct 2 culverts near Moncton that would reconnect overwintering amphibians with their spring breeding pools, which were on the other side of the road. These structures have been wildly successful. They regularly document more than 2,000 amphibian crossings annually, along with a raft of other small species who use these culverts. The second story I want to highlight, which has probably done more than any other wildlife crossing for raising awareness about this issue, and that is the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Crossing at Liberty Canyon. There truly are not enough superlatives to describe this project. It's received an unprecedented amount of local support, including a record-breaking $25 million Conservation Challenge grant from Wallace-Annenberg and the Annenberg Foundation. When it's built, it'll be the largest wildlife bridge in the world, spanning 10 lanes of one of the busiest roadways in the US. And it's going to set a global standard for urban connectivity for everything from mountain lions to mule deer to deer mice. So just a hats off to the incredible tenacity of Beth Pratt and the National Wildlife Federation and all the other project partners who have worked tirelessly for over a decade to make this dream a reality. On the opposite end of the spectrum is a project like this one in upstate New York. At the time this was built, the wildlife crossing shelf cost less than $30,000. And it's a great example of how existing structures, such as the culvert shown here, may be retrofitted to provide safe passage for terrestrial wildlife on an otherwise shoestring budget. For the last example, I'm circling back to California, and I just want to highlight what is arguably one of the most innovative new designs to emerge in the past few years. This is a raised roadway design. It was developed and pilot tested on a low volume Forest Service road, and it essentially reconnects the California Yosemite toad from its upland overwintering habitat to its lowland breeding pools. So I'm excited about this new tool in the toolbox of mitigation measures aimed at providing safe passage for amphibians and reptiles. So if you'd like to learn more about the wildlife funding opportunities and also some of the related policy opportunities that were included in last year's bipartisan infrastructure law, I would invite you to check out the Federal Highways website on the new law. They're providing regular updates on implementation. And then in addition to this federal highway site, the US DOT has a similar website. It's basically the same URL shown here, except that instead of starting out with FHWA, it starts out with transportation.gov. Each of these sites provides a little bit different information. Federal Highways is, of course, focused on highways and bridges. The US DOT site also provides links to all of the notices of funding opportunities that I've been mentioning. If you go on that site and just scroll down about midway, you will see updates on those funding opportunities under their highlights section. So this concludes my talk. I'd like to thank you all again for joining today. I would invite you to visit ARK's website. Again, looking back at that carousel on our homepage, the very first image is a link to the infrastructure law. We are compiling and highlighting information that is specific to wildlife. And I would also invite you all to reach out to me directly with any questions or to learn more at rcallahan at ark-solutions.org. Thanks again.
Thank you, Alicia and Renee, for your incredibly informative and inspiring presentations. It is extraordinary to hear of the positive actions taking place on connectivity. And having policymakers allocate funding for wildlife crossing projects will truly make our highways safer for people and animals. We encourage you to take a look at the wonderful world of wildlife crossings to see if there are any wildlife crossing projects underway in your state. You can also investigate whether there are opportunities to help make highways safer for people and animals in your own backyard. This could be as simple as investigating whether there are any known wildlife vehicle crash hotspots or seasonal wildlife movements in your community. And don't forget that in addition to the big animal migrations that we typically see in the Western United States, there are lots of micro migrations of reptiles, amphibians, and small animals too, who may need some help to safely cross the road. Finally, please consider signing up on the Federal Highway Bipartisan Infrastructure site if you'd like to receive regular updates on the new law or reach out to ARK directly to learn more. As Alicia mentioned, if you have any questions or have interest in legislative actions, please contact the Animal Legal Defense Fund's Legislative Affairs Program. Thank you so much for joining us.